Welcome to the American Railroading Podcast, brought to you by the Revolution Rail Group, live from the great state of Texas. Join us as we educate, entertain, and explore the world of American railroading. Here's your host, industry veteran, Don Walsh.
Well, hey, welcome everybody to the American Railroading Podcast. I am your host, Don Walsh, President and CEO of the Revolution Rail Group. We are the anchor sponsor of the American Railroading Podcast. We're a consulting and brokering firm in the railcar industry. So if you'd like to need assistance with any kind of consulting, whether it's process flow analysis, market analysis, or anything like that, and more, we can help you. Also, if you're looking to buy, sell, lease, or sublease rail cars, we can help you with that as well. You can reach out to us today at 844-455-3434 or info@therevolutionrailgroup.com, or you can check out our full suite of services at our website at therevolutionrailgroup.com. Well, you know, it's kind of funny. In the last episode, I opened up by saying it's hurricane season here in Houston, and I'll be darned if a few days later we didn't get hit by one head on, which was very sneaky of Hurricane Beryl because it was supposed to land like 4 hours south of us and changed its mind apparently on Sunday afternoon. But all is good, all is well. Everybody here at the podcast and producer John and everybody, we're all good. So thank you to those of us that called, to those of you that called and texted and emailed to make sure we're all right. And we are. And there's still like 100,000 people out of power right now, which is insane since it's been 10 days or so. So feel free to keep them in your prayers at this time. But my birthday month is coming up in August. So just a little reminder for everybody out there, I do accept gratuitous gifts for my birthday. Just a little hint. You don't have to do that, but if you want to, feel free. Thanks to all of you that you continue to support the podcast, for all your listening and downloading and watching and viewing. We remain in the top 10% of all podcasts globally, which is truly a blessing. So thank you so much. We have now added another country. So we're now downloaded in 42 countries around the world on 35 different platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and so forth. The U.S. remains number one by far, by like 93%. Canada is number two. Australia is third, strongly in third, with Latvia, Switzerland, and Germany not far behind. And now Mexico is making a strong showing. So thank you to our friends in Mexico for coming aboard and making a strong showing this last month. I also want to say hello to our newest friends in Croatia. Croatia is now country number 42 to have joined us, as well as our friends in Italy and Japan. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much. Please continue to download, subscribe, and leave us some reviews. So reviews are very important to the success of the show. So by leaving us reviews, it actually gets us further and further into the algorithms on Apple Podcasts especially, but on all the different platforms. And you can also do it on our website if you'd like at americanrailroading.net. But it helps us a bunch because it gets us further out there for more people to enjoy us. So please leave us a 5-star review if you would like. We would certainly like that. Also, if you liked what you heard on the podcast, you can buy us a cup of coffee. So it's essentially like leaving us a tip for doing a good job. So you can go onto our website at americanrailroading.net. You'll see a little yellow coffee cup at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. You can click on that and you can buy us 1 cup, 3 cup, 5 cups, or any number of cups. There's a little box. You can just add in whatever amount you'd like. And it's essentially, like I said, leaving us a tip and going toward the endeavors of the podcast. So thank you for those of you that have and those of you that will. Don't forget, we have a YouTube channel as well. Many of you like to watch our videos versus listening to just the audio. So you can watch our videos on americanrailroading.net and click on videos, or on our YouTube channel at YouTube at American Railroading Podcast. Be sure to check out our online store. I know you guys have been excited about that this year. And don't forget, Christmas is coming soon. It's not that far away anymore. So get ready for your railroading family and friends and load up on your merch for American Railroading. And one of those items is our challenge coins. So those of you that are in the military or have been in the military, have family in the military, you'll understand what the challenge coins are all about. Many of the railroads have challenge coins as well. I've been able to exchange one for another at some of the conferences. It's been kind of fun. But the purchase of the challenge coins is very important because we have a great passion for our veterans and those enlisted here on the podcast. And a portion of the sales of the challenge coins this year will go toward our friends at Boots for Troops. So if you're not familiar with Boots for Troops, and again, in full transparency, I am a committee member and volunteer with Boots for Troops. We provide care packages to our troops overseas, and it's specially tailored to them. So they'll send us a letter, and we fill it out specifically to whatever it is that they want. If they're a Chicago Bears fan, a Philadelphia Phillies fan, so on, it's specifically catered to them. And we had a bunch of other goodies in there as well. But we also provide service dog training for our veterans, scholarship programs for spouses, and travel assistance as well. So if you purchase challenge coins through our store at AmericanRoading.net and then click on the store tab, a portion of the sales will go toward Boots for Troops this year. So please check that out. We're continuing to accept our podcast sponsorships also. Now, we only have one gold sponsorship remaining. I'm very excited to tell you about our new gold sponsor. It's not a secret anymore, but you're going to have to wait. You have to wait till the middle of the episode when we'll share who that is. But we also have silver sponsorships available. We have one gold sponsorship left. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor of the American Railroading Podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out to us because spots are limited. You can reach out to us at marketing@americanrailroading.net. Again, that's marketing@americanrailroading.net. And again, stay tuned for our gold sponsor announcement halfway through the episode. So don't fall asleep. Don't turn the podcast off. You have to listen to the whole thing. With that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our platinum sponsor, the Alden Company. Founded in 1904, Alden has been an industry leader, charting a steady course in the manufacturing and distribution of a wide variety of railroad safety and track repair tools and more. The Alden website boasts over 800 catalog items to choose from, with categories including track maintenance and repair, derailers and railers, signs and lights, wheel chocks and stops, rail cars and locomotives, and even truck docks. Alden provides outstanding customer service with a wide variety of solutions, and when you call them, you will always get a real person to talk to, not an automated service. While based in the Chicagoland area, the Alden name is known internationally, and with over 120 years in the rail industry, they're a company you can count on. Please reach out to our friends at Alden today at 847-623-8800 or e-rail@aldenco.com. You can also review all of their products and resources on their website at www.aldenco.com. Alden, keeping things on track since 1904. So we're launching our second annual Honor Our Heroes gift package award this month. So those of you that have been listening since last year, you know we did this last year as well. And our friend Joe with CSX won last year, a Marine veteran, I believe. And very excited to have been able to do that for him. And I actually packaged it all up myself. So I went over to our friends at Boots for Troops here in Tomball, Texas, and they let me pick all the items for the care package. And of course, Joe gave us a list of items that he wanted, and we loaded that thing up. And I believe he got it just in time for Christmas. And he sent us a picture, and he actually posted it on LinkedIn as well. And it was really wonderful of us to do that. So let me tell you a little bit about the care package itself. So the idea here is we want to honor veterans in the railroad industry. You don't have to be a railroader. You don't have to work for a Class 1 railroad or a short line or anything like that, as long as your job has anything to do with our industry. So you could be working for a shipper. You could be working for a parts manufacturer. You can be working for a rail car builder, a leasing company, what have you. As long as your job is related to rail and you're a veteran, you qualify. Now, you can't nominate yourself. You have to be nominated by somebody else, but that doesn't mean that you can't go and call someone and say, hey, I'd really like you to nominate me for this award. You can do that, and you can be nominated as many times as you want, And so, but those of you that are like me, that you're not a veteran, but you support our veterans, please think about nominating someone. These folks put their lives on the line for us, and they deserve something like this, right? And I believe that we're somewhere near, 2-to-1 ratio veterans to non-veterans in the transportation industry. So there's plenty of veterans out there to nominate. So let me tell you how you can do that. So if you want to nominate somebody for the Boots for Troops Honor Our Heroes gift package, you go and email them at info@boots4troops.com. Again, info@boots4troops.com. And then be sure to put in the American Railroading Podcast Honor Our Heroes nominee in the subject line. And then here's the information you're going to need to provide. It's a little simpler than what we started out with last year. We found that it was a little bit too cumbersome. So we just need the nominee's name, their branch of military, their rank, years served, any medals and awards, their rail-related job, whatever it is, and the company they work for now or that they retired from if they're retired. And then tell us why you feel this person should be a hero and be honored in this fashion. So again, make sure you put the American Railroading Podcast Honor Our Heroes Award and the subject matter when you do send us the email. And again, the email is at info@boots4troops.com. All nominations must be submitted by Friday, September 13th. Yes, Friday the 13th. I know, that just happens to be the way it fell. So we're not superstitious around here. So please submit all nominations by Friday, September 13th. I'll remind you again on our next episode as well. And then we'll be announcing and drawing the winner with our friends from Boots for Troops on the September episode 2024. So again, looking forward to seeing nominations, lots and lots of nominations, and nominate as many people as you want, as often as you want. So we're looking forward to that. So as far as our episode for today, this is a subject matter and a guest that I've wanted on for a long time. And it's it's kind of funny. I'm sure we've all been sitting in traffic and seen a train going by with military equipment on it and going, where are they going? Are they going off to war? Why is this happening? Is this unusual? I know I always have whenever I've seen the Humvees and all the different vehicles going by on a rail car. One, I think it's pretty cool. And two, what are they doing? Where are they going? Well, I did not realize that there is actually a division of the U.S. Army that focuses specifically on transportation of stuff, including rail. It's the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. So I reached out to them a year ago and said, hey, can we talk? I would love to have you guys on the podcast, love to have you guys talk to the audience about what it is y'all do, how long you've been doing it, why we do it. It's just fascinating to me, and I think it will be to you as well. So we'll be discussing that today and a whole lot more as we learn about the long history between the U.S. military and American railroading. Our guest for today is Joseph Sepp Scanlin. He's museum director for the U.S. Army Transportation Museum in Fort Eustis, Virginia. As a native of Virginia, Sepp obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Relations from James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania, where he later became commissioned in the U.S. Army in 1994. Sepp received a Master of Arts degree in National Security Strategy at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island in 2007. In 2016, Sepp graduated from Johns Hopkins University with a Master's in Museum Studies with a specialty certification in digital curation. As a U.S. Army veteran, Sepp served 21 years on active duty. Thank you for your service, Sepp, providing intelligence support to armor, infantry, aviation, and special forces before retiring as a lieutenant colonel. After retiring, Sepp served as a museum director for the 10th Mountain Division and Fort Drum Museum from October 2016 until July of 2022, where he oversaw the renovation and relocation of the museum to its new facility. Today, Sepp is a renowned military historian and museum expert. He is currently the museum director for the U.S. Army Transportation Museum in Fort Eustis, Virginia, where he continues working to preserve American military transportation history and educate students using a wide variety of military history topics. Sepp has facilitated a variety of military groups on education tours of battlefields to include the World War II sites in Italy, Antietam, and Lexington and Concord, and he serves on the board of the 10th Mountain Division Foundation and the Williamsburg Battlefield Association. Sepp currently lives in Williamsburg, Virginia with his wife, Amy, and enjoys sharing his love of history, service, and unique stories of the U.S. Army, and believes that we should always stay curious. And with that, I say welcome, Sepp, to the American Railroading Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real honor. It's a phenomenal podcast, and I really appreciate the opportunity to tell the Army story and share our common lineage as railroaders in the United States Army. So thanks again.
For sure. It's my pleasure. And so I've got to ask, what got you interested in military history and museums in the first place?
My father was a retired lieutenant colonel as well, so he grew up taking me to lots of military sites. In fact, his last duty station was none other than Letterkenny Army Depot in Pennsylvania, where they had a rail spur, and they used the rail to move around a lot of the equipment. So I have a photo of myself as a 3-year-old staring at Army locomotives. So I have to say part of my my start was probably there. My first visit to the very museum that I'm in charge of now was in 1977. Only 2 years after it's really founded and being built. But really, I'd always volunteered at museums and historical sites. On my mother's side, she was a big museum goer, kind of always encouraged me. So when I decided to retire from the Army, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I was volunteering at a museum, and one of my volunteer supervisors at the time kind of mentored me into that this could be a real profession. So I chose to seek the degree in museum studies and was lucky enough to come back into the Army as an Army civilian working in museums. So I call it the best halfway house known to man.
I love that. And it's funny. I talk about how we see these as we're sitting in traffic. We'll see them come by on rail lines. And the one story I may have shared with you on the side, I don't recall, was when I was running a rail car repair facility in Chicago, and it was the end of the night, and I think it was on a Friday. Everybody was going home, and I get this random message on the radio. It says, "Hey, boss, you might want to come out here and look at this." And I don't know what they're called, but they were on a flatbed rail car, and they were in our yard by accident. They got dropped off there completely by accident, but they were these trucks that had a bed. They were huge. I don't know how many axles they had, probably 4 or 5 easily, but they had this bed on the back that would lift up, and I guess it launched rockets off the back. And I'm like, I don't think those are supposed to be here. so so I just thought it was the coolest thing. But we did not touch them. For the record, we did not touch them. We left the doors sealed. We didn't mess with them at all. We called the proper people and said, we need to get these out of here before some kids in the neighborhood figure out that they're here. But I just thought that was the coolest thing. So speaking of cool, your nickname, Sepp, is awesome. Where does that come from?
So my official name is Joseph Edward Scanlin Jr. So I'm a junior. My father, while he was stationed overseas, actually met a wonderful German woman who eventually became his wife. So when they had me here in the States, they decided Dad really wanted a junior. Mom was like, okay, but what are we going to call him? Because we're not calling him Junior. So a Southern German derivative of Joseph is actually Sepp. So it's Schwäbisch, which is a specific Southern German dialect. So I like to tell everybody it's redneck German. So I actually have a German derivative nickname of Sepp, and a very unique name. So it's helped me throughout my entire life. So really appreciate it.
I bet it has. Well, it's great. All right. Most people, as I said, we've seen military vehicles on trains before. Most didn't realize, including me, that there was an entire division of the military dedicated to transportation, which, as we said earlier, is the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, whose mantra is "Nothing happens until something moves." I like that, and it's very true. In reviewing the website, the Army Transportation Corps goes all the way back to using horse-drawn carriages, which is crazy during the Revolutionary War, actually. So how cool is that? And there's different modes of transportation that, even though we're going to talk about rail today, and we're a rail, obviously, podcast, there's multiple different facets of transportation that the Army Transportation Corps deals with. And the other areas are Army watercraft, which is cool. I looked it up. It's pretty neat. Strategic development, air and sea operations, movement control, and motor transport. So, Sepp, if you could take just a moment and go through each one of those categories and tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, so the Transportation Corps itself is the responsible entity for strategic movement in any medium for the United States Army. So through our long history, we started with vehicles, wagons, and then we also had ships. So we've kept those two. Obviously, the technology is advanced, but the mechanism of movement, roads, where we still have all the truck drivers of the Army belong to the Transportation Corps. So all those large trucks that move the tanks and the smaller trucks and all those things, the big heavy equipment movers of the Army belong to the Transportation Corps. In addition, we also own the Army's Navy, the small logistics support vessels, so not combat craft, but those boats and ships that are in the Army to move material, and they've become very prominent, right? If most people do not know, but the pier system that was recently installed in Gaza was part of the Army Transportation Corps. So those are Army watercraft operators that are operating around the world today. And then in addition, because of the transportation basis of aviation, for 40 years, the Army Transportation Corps owned the helicopters for the United States Army before the creation of aviation branch. So they were responsible for the development of most, rotary wing aircraft that we are recognized today. So we have those. My collection kind of represents that, which is really awesome. I have as I tell people, I have the coolest motor pool in the Army. I have a rocket pelt. I have flying cars. I have helicopters, planes, boats, trains, trucks, Jeeps, you name it. So we really cover the motto of nothing happens until something moves. So we have all the movement.
That's amazing. I didn't know you had ships, but that makes sense for logistics and things like that, or supply chain, I suppose, right? Your own supply chain.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And, we partner closely with all our sister services. And in fact, there's a lot of crossover in the rail that we can talk about later. But at the end of the day is, we have to get our stuff where it is needed to execute the larger mission of the United States Army. So we do some diverse movements around the world.
And I wondered about that too, and that's a very good point. So, do you coordinate with other branches as well?
We, at the museum level, yes, we do. Some of our equipment was developed in coordination with other services. And then obviously a lot of our stuff will intermodal transportation is a thing that the military has been doing since its earliest stages. And often that intermodal crosses services. So we may put some of our equipment onto a Navy ship or U.S. Air Force aircraft. So we've been doing that for as long as all of the services have been around.
Wow, that's great. And so, focusing on rail now. So, I want to go through the history of the relationship and the connection between the Army and the railroads. And you mentioned when we spoke the other day that the AAR has been very involved, the Association of American Railroads has been very involved with the Army and the Transportation Corps over the years. I believe that the relationship actually goes back to the Civil War. So, let's start there if we can. Can you share with our audience how the relationship kind of all started?
Yeah, I think even before the Civil War, I think one of the things that if you really dig into the history, you'll find, particularly in the early rail industry in the United States, there was a lot of hidden veterans within it. One of the major engineering schools in the United States at that time was West Point, the United States Military Academy. It was an engineering school. So a lot of people that graduated from that would go into the state of the art engineering businesses of the time, which was the rail industry. So even immediately following, kind of the Mexican-American War, things along those lines, the West Pointers, when they were looking for a profession, when they were done with their military service, would join the rail industry. And some of the senior leaders that we would see kind of rise to prominence in the American Civil War are kind of products of that. They were successful military officers, but then they were also really successful rail entrepreneurs, builders, engineers, and things along those lines. So I think our story is so intertwined. It may not be as well known, but it is definitely a common birth. And we spring from the same, if it's not from the same seed, we may spring from the same orchard. And that goes directly into the American Civil War. So many of those people that are working for the rail industry, when the nation calls, they answer that call, just like the veterans that you're talking about and honoring today. And they take off their rail uniforms and they put on their nation's uniforms. And what they did at that time is they leveraged that expertise on behalf of the nation. So and rail becomes immediately impactful on the battlefields of the American Civil War. So.
And let's dive into that just a little bit, because I know that when I was visiting some states over the years, there's museums obviously in pretty much every major city of different kinds. And I was there one, I can't remember exactly where it was, but talking about the effect of rail, where it was really heavily utilized to obviously help logistically and supplies and things like that. And then also on the flip side, the opposing side wanted to eliminate the railroad for that reason, right? So what would you say were significant impacts in the relationship between the Army and railroads during the Civil War?
If you want to talk, you can talk at every level of the conflict, from the very personal level all the way to deciding of the outcome of the war. And we'll start at the top. So at the strategic level for the decision is the rail industry it's in both entities that fight the war. The Union has a strong rail industry in the Northeast, but the Southerners have developed some rail connections down in the South. So both sides come pre-armed with existing rail infrastructure that they can use. Very early on, the Confederate Army actually figures out how to leverage that pretty quickly, and very much into a shock of actual battlefield effects. So in the very first Battle of Bull Run or Battle of Manassas, the Confederate Army is able to move almost 20,000 troops from the Shenandoah Valley to the battlefield, and they literally get off the train and march into the battle. So from day one, from the first major battle, railroads are having an impact. But over the length of the war, the ability for the Northerners to maximize the breadth and the depth of their industry, particularly their rail industry and all the supporting manufacturers behind that, allows them to shift the weight of the industrial base of the North to eventually become victorious in the war. And they do this in many ways. They actually use this rail both to move their forces, but also to sustain themselves. And you see it in every theater of the war. And the industry itself is very important in their contribution, because at this stage, there's a lot of diversity between the various rail lines. There's different gauges. There's different, they are not the synchronized system that we kind of appreciate today. But you begin to see with the Union, President Lincoln helps because he actually nationalizes the rail industry during the American Civil War. But he literally nationalizes it just so he can kind of direct it, but he doesn't take ownership of running it. The industries continue to run it. But they absolutely see the value of, like, we better get this together and support this for our own good. And what really happens is they learn to be more efficient and more effective. They don't build a lot of additional capacity because but they almost double the throughput that they are able to do. And where they're really learning the lessons is kind of the next level. So the next level of kind of on the battlefield effects, probably one of the most recognizable names for the American Civil War and the railroad is General Herman Haupt. His title is actually the construction engineer. So he's responsible for restoring lines and operating lines, particularly here in Virginia in 1862 timeframe. And what he's tasked with is, as the Confederate Army retreats, they see the strategic advantage of these rail lines, and they do not want to leave that unmolested in the hands of the Union Army. So they remove all the locomotives and the rolling stock, and then they try to destroy as many of the choke points as they can, generally bridges, culverts, overpasses, and things like that. Well, General Herman Haupt had worked as one of those individuals who had graduated West Point, had a very successful rail career in Pennsylvania, famously as the engineer for the Hoosick Tunnel. But he comes down south and he begins to adapt the railroads to the needs of a conflict zone. So he puts the construction units together to put the lines rapidly back into operation. He also begins to develop systems for efficient use of the rails where they don't necessarily have the sidings where they need them, because the conflict is driving the stops as opposed to the cities and the urban areas. And he actually butts up against a lot of it, the fellow general officers. There's a lot of friction, but to the extent he finally appeals for higher level help, and the Secretary of War basically says nobody can mess with General Haupt in the running of railroads without my express permission. So he gets an overview IOU that says I control railroads. So everything from the loading and unloading to the construction to the scheduling, he implements, and they're still to this day called Herman Haupt's Rules of Railroading during the American Civil War. He eventually does have enough run-ins that he leaves the service in the middle of the war, but everything he puts in place exists for the Union Army for the length of the war. So he really sets the railroad on that strategic direction that allows the Union forces to maximize that piece. And then at the very personal level, one of my favorite stories, probably because I grew up in that era, is at the personal level, the first medals of honor ever issued were for a special operations, what we would call a Navy SEAL or an Army Special Forces operation today, operation that involved railroads, right? It was the Great Locomotive Chase, where they were trying to impact, the Union sent people across the Confederate lines to steal a train and conduct destruction of a key Confederate rail line. It's famously documented in the Disney movie, The Great Locomotive Chase, but literally the first medals of honor are issued to the members of that raid. And particularly for your listeners, it may be interesting to know the most recent issued medals of honor by the United States were for two of those members who were neglected during the initial issue. So that they were just recognized last month, I believe, with new medals of honor for actions in the Civil War. So their family members are now holders of those medals, and it all involves the railroad. So it's literally very, very deep embedded in the history of the American Civil War, and the good and the bad, right? We're able to develop new technologies, hospital cars. This is where the hospital cars first come into existence. So we're able to take care of our wounded much quicker. We're able to get them from the battlefields in places like Gettysburg back to DC so they can get more quality medical care. So it literally mirrors everything that is going on in that conflict.
That's really amazing. And you mentioned the hospital train, so I just want to share this story with everybody real quick. So, I mean, most of you know that I was raised in the industry and the rail car repair side of things and have overseen shops all over the United States. And there was one in Bucyrus, Ohio. And those of you that work out there, you're going to think this is pretty cool. I remember the story of how I think it was World War One, might have been two. I don't remember, and maybe you can remind me which one you think it was. But they turned that location into a school of sorts to teach people how to operate inside of a hospital train and how to like the nurses and the doctors and how to function inside of a hospital train. I thought that was the coolest thing. So a lot of our railcar repair shops that are out there today that have been around for a long time have stories like that. If you folks want to dig in, look at the history of those shops near you or ones that you work at, they're more than likely involved in some way, shape, or form with war efforts throughout the years.
Yeah, I think that was probably World War II, because that 1940 to 41 to 45 period, all the rail companies are, I mean, the only way to say it is knee deep in the war effort, right? They literally turn over their operations to the nation to do what the nation needs. All those shops became training areas for the various rail units that would eventually deploy during the Second World War.
Yeah, and we'll get more into World War II here in a minute. Looking forward to that. Now, the Spanish-American War is next, and that, I believe, was our first time that the Army was deployed in a transportation sense overseas. So how did that change things?
Well, that is, we love to tell that story here in the museum, particularly to our young junior officers, because that operation is full of lessons because we didn't do so well, right? A lot of the operations that were planned, partly it was because the way the operation was planned was supposed to be much smaller scale than was eventually directed by the president and his staff. But what really comes out of it is there was no synchronization. They had forgotten all the rules that they had developed during the American Civil War. So what happened is individual units and their commanders, people famously like Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, they would grab the local train department and they would contract for their own train services. And they knew the port of embarkation for Cuba in particular was Tampa, Florida. So they would get their train and they would make their way to Tampa, Florida. Well, there was no synchronization of the movement of all these various rails, or the unloading and then subsequent loading of the ships at the port of Tampa. And so, as you can imagine, pandemonium ensues. They cannot nearly get the number of trains into the port and then the soldiers off onto the ships in a timely fashion. There's some reports that say that the trains were backed up from Tampa, Florida, all the way to Atlanta, Georgia on the rail lines because there was such a congestion of units trying to make their way to the port. And that just shows the War Department itself saw this. They conducted a massive reorganization after the Spanish-American War to address these critical issues of deployment, embarkation, and debarkation that they would need. And the same held true in the watercraft field. That is where we begin to get our first watercraft in the Army. The Army Transport Service, that is the Army's Navy, is founded out of the same conflict and same challenge.
Well, and then next is World War One, which ushered in the official creation of the Army Transportation Service and Motor Transport Corps, as the days of the horse-drawn carriages were over. And it's hard to think back about horse-drawn carriages that we even utilized them up to that point. But we did, obviously. So I imagine there were significant changes from the Civil War to the Spanish-American War, now going into World War One, just even technology-wise.
Yeah, the technology is now solidified. The rail industry in the United States is much more integrated. There's less of the having to change gauges between the various entities, and it's a true powerhouse industry in the United States at this point. That's advantageous through the movement to the ports and to get overseas. But even then, it's a very unique time because the Wilson administration decides to take a page out of the book from Lincoln, and they actually nationalize the rail industry and actually put it under military control. And they create the U.S. Rail Administration for the length of the war. This is not a popular move, and the rail industry kind of keeps that in their back pocket, and they learn that lesson. But despite that, they are still huge patriots and continue to support the war effort. So what happens is, we are late players to the war effort overall. I mean, the war starts in 1914. We really don't get heavily involved until 1917. But we know we are going to need rail in a new place. We're going to have to operate our own rail systems in Europe. So we begin to establish what would essentially be grow into the military rail service. And what they do is it's under the Corps of Engineers, because the Transportation Corps has not been formally established. So it's going to be run by the Corps of Engineers. But they know that they need expertise. So the colonel of an individual regiment will be an active duty colonel of engineers. But his deputy, his lieutenant colonel, will come directly from one of the main rail lines. And there's a lot of really recognizable rail, industry kind of critical names that actually chose to re-enlist, and they go in as a lieutenant colonel, and they provide that level of rail expertise to allow the system to function. These organizations form, they conduct training generally sponsored by the individual rail companies, a model that we'll see again in the Second World War. But what they do is they go down to their shops and they say who wants to join the rail unit as part of this rail, from the shops. We'll guarantee your jobs. And they basically take the shops and pack them up and send them overseas. What the rail industry does is really interesting. We do ship some of our own material over, but it's pretty slow to get there. And what the U.S. actually does is, because the Belgian rail rolling stock had been evacuated to avoid being captured by the Germans, it was sitting idle. So the Americans essentially lease the entire Belgian rail rolling stock from the Belgian country to use to fill in that gap for our initial equipment. So we are falling in on European rail equipment initially that will slowly be replaced by American rail over time as we can get it shipped over. So what are they doing? They're doing the traditional logistics things. They're using existing rail lines in France to move troops, material from the U.S. ports of debarkation to the front and impact that. But the way they did this is they essentially formed 9 separate regiments of rail engineer units, and that totals about 18,000 people is what they do. And that's for the main line, the heavy logistics. There's also a sub-element of this that does light rail, and that's about another 15,000 people. So by the end of the war, there's probably about 70,000 soldiers that go overseas to work in the rail industry alone during the First World War. And that's everything from the shops to repairing the rails to running the trains and running the rail depots that support the maintenance and the upkeep of all of that. And the light rail units are probably the most unique because they are have to be the most flexible. And when we say light rails, it's kind of everything from the smallest stuff. They actually had very small gauge rails, very similar to the kiddie park rails that they would put into the frontline trenches. The reason being is if they left the rails and the trains visible, then they would be impacted by enemy artillery. So the ability to rapidly pull those sections of rail out before daylight so the Germans could not observe that. But the fun part is they use the same gauge as the Germans. So if we took a German frontline trace and they left their rail line in place, we could just lay some small bridge works over and connect our rail system into theirs and continue to sustain ourselves. So literally at every size of rail operations, it was happening in the front lines. And rail, I would argue, the similarities to today is the efficiency of the transport of rail was the critical factor. You could move more stuff and more people faster than we could on horse-drawn carriages, the new trucks that we have fielded during the First World War, and even on the barges and boats. It just wasn't available. So the way to get material to the front during the First World War was rail. And we really don't see a change of that until after Korea.
And you've mentioned gauge a few times. So just for our audience that's not familiar, that's essentially the width between the rail heads. Yeah, so they weren't all the same from country to country, or even within the U.S. at times. So you couldn't use the same equipment, and I think some of that was strategic, if I remember correctly, where they did that kind of on purpose so that you couldn't use equipment from one to the other.
Yeah, and I mean it's still, you can still see elements of it in Europe. When I was a young college kid and I went Eurailing, like when you cross from France into Spain, the gauge changes, and you had to get off on one platform, go across, and get on a Spanish train to continue your travels. And partly was because this from the Spanish Civil War, they had not integrated themselves into the European rail infrastructure, and they were okay with it even back in 1990.
I bet. And so from World War I to World War II, we talked about World War II a little bit. I imagine there was a lot of similarities, but were there any major differences?
I think the biggest difference is what we alluded to in the last conversation. The rail industry did not want to be taken over formally by the federal government. They wanted to be seen as a partner. They operated as a partner, but they did everything in their power to make sure that they maintained their autonomy. And they did it in a way that's absolutely supported the war effort. So they what they didn't change is they offered all their shops, all their workforce, and they individually raised essentially railway operating battalions internal to each line. Or if there was more excess capacity, they would be combined with other rail lines to make additional battalions to go overseas. And this is a really, I mean, the rail industry should be very proud. I mean, this is a huge highlight of how they stood up and were counted, not just as individuals as patriots, but as organizations as patriots, right? They each have, and if you go, I grew up in Roanoke, so I'm very familiar with Norfolk and Southern, but if you go into many of the traditional rail headquarters buildings, you will often see memorials for those service members that went to war from that rail company. And they usually went as a consolidated unit. So they knew each other and they'd work together, and that added to the efficiency they provided overseas. So I think that is probably the single biggest advantage that they offered. And then we can talk a little bit. They pay a little bit of a penalty, right? Though everything is for the war industry, so they do not do a lot of technological innovation for that 4 to 5 year period. And when they come out of the Second World War, a lot of the rolling stock and a lot of the material is it's pre 1940 or earlier. It's been ridden pretty hard for those years, and they really hadn't been able to advance the rail industry, which is what I think allows some of the car boom to come in and begin to impact the rail travel inside the United States. So, there's some pluses and some minuses to this, but they absolutely contributed to the war effort in a way they should be immensely proud.
Well, and I believe the Korean War is very important to you. I know that you mentioned that to me before, and I also believe that it was our first involvement for the Transportation Corps in the Pacific region. Is that correct?
No, actually, the Transportation Corps was heavily involved in the Pacific campaign during the Second World War.
That's right.
In fact, one of the kind of the best books, individual accounts, is the head of the Military Railway Service in the Second World War wrote a book. And I have it here as one of my key references is General Carl Gray Jr. is who wrote it, but it was called Railroading in 18 Countries because the U.S. military railroad system was operating in 18 different countries during the Second World War. We operated in some places that most Americans don't know that American service members served in the Second World War. We, American railroaders, ran the main line in Iraq and Iran to provide the Lend-Lease equipment to the Soviet Union. So one of our locomotives actually saw service in Iran during the Second World War. In China, Burma, India, right? So literally they're doing very innovative stuff in that theater just because it is so difficult to get material there. They're operating local rail lines, but they also take the famed Willis Jeep and they adapt that to make it a railroad car. Because they can't get locomotives there, they take 2 Jeeps, they take the wheels off, they adapt essentially rail wheels to the chassis, and they put 2 of those together, and they run small, they call them bailing wire cannonballs, where they can put a couple freight cars behind 2 Jeeps, and then they would run the rails in very jungleless environments in the China, Burma, India theater. We have great photos of them using elephants to load trains in that same theater. And there's a really funny account that we have in our exhibits about they actually did in some cases have old locomotives, steam locomotives that they were using. And they get a report that the train is broken down. So the maintenance crew shows up to check on the locomotive, and they find out that they just didn't have any water. The water tender had emptied, and they're like, how could we have emptied the water tender? Well, unbeknownst to them, in the car immediately behind the tender was an elephant who had removed the top of the water trough and had drunk or sprayed all the water as they were going down the rails. So they ran out of water like miles before they had anticipated needing a water stop. So there's all these amazing stories from places that most people do not know that the Army Transportation Corps was doing railroad operations. So, but yeah, in World War II, we operated in every theater, the Mediterranean theater, the Middle East theater, the European theater, and the Pacific theater. So we rebuilt the Philippine rail system upon the reoccupation of the Philippines after we re-attacked. And one of our first actions was to put that rail back in service, and we would run that on behalf of the Army initially, and then on behalf of the Philippine people for several years after the war.
I'm just making a note to keep elephants away from my water stash. For future reference. No, that's a great story. I love that. Anything else particular about the Korean War before I move on to?
Well, yeah, in the Korean War, we did use trains pretty regularly. We'd spent a little bit of time after the Second World War rebuilding that rail network because it was heavily damaged. The Japanese had occupied Korea and hadn't invested much in the rail infrastructure. So we had begun that work when the Korean War happens. So luckily we were fairly familiar with what was there. But during the length of the Korean War, we would absolutely expand that network and continue to operate that. And because our Koreans continue to be strategic partners of the United States, is that rail infrastructure that we participated in repairing in the 50s is still a critical asset that people look at in the nation of Korea. So we used trains for one of the most interesting things we used the trains for was at the very end of the war. There were two operations called Operation Little Switch and Operation Big Switch, and that was the repatriation of prisoners that had been taken by Americans that had been taken by the North Koreans and the Chinese, returned to friendly custody, and then the reverse. We would return North Koreans and Chinese that we'd captured back, and trains figure heavily in that operation. So to me, there's very few more profound operations than returning somebody that has been separated from their nation involuntarily for several years back into custody. So you can imagine how important it was for them to see an American locomotive, an American passenger car, and know that car was starting them on their journey back to their homeland after so many years of tough service. So again, railroading is involved in everything that we do.
Well, and that leads me to the Cold War. So, you don't think about transportation necessarily regarding the Cold War. In what way were we involved there?
So in the Cold War is probably some of our heaviest rail use in Europe. There's so many ways. Just like when we started off the podcast, you joked about seeing all those military pieces on rails. Growing up and visiting my German family, I can vividly remember taking the train and being passed by a European train carrying tanks and army trucks and things, and my face plastered to the glass, watching all these, big green machines that I was fascinated with as a young child going past on the train headed the other direction. So a lot of our material was continued to be moved by rail in Europe. And in fact, one of the most when you come visit the museum and you see our exhibits on our actual rail cars, probably, we have a 40-foot flat car that everybody just kind of says, oh, it's a flat car. It carries stuff. It's not super unique. From us in the museum's perspective, it is the most important rail car we have because it's a combo one where one side has American couplings and one side has European couplings. So without that car, I can't move the rest of my rolling stock because I have both. I have European couplings and American couplings, and that is the only common connector between those two. And that dates from that period. that we used it overseas, and then we brought it back here to train Army railroaders, because a lot of their work was not going to be on the standard American setup, but they would have to operate European style cars, whether it be box cars, locomotives, any of the various cars that they could come into contact with over in Europe. And then one of the most unique pieces that we have here from a rail perspective is they're representative. They're 1980 era cars, but they represent a unique mission that Army Transportation Corps ran for 45 years. So a very unique train that left West Germany and would travel on rail through East Germany all the way to West Berlin. It was called the Berlin Duty Car. So if you were assigned to duty in West Berlin, one of the ways you would get there was by the rail. And that train was operated by the United States Army, but it had to transit our adversaries at the time, the East Germans. So it traveled only at night. All the curtains would have to be closed. The Russians and the East Germans would stop that train and inspect it at regular checkpoints, but they were not allowed to enter the train. So American MPs, the train commander themselves, they would get off and they would interface with the East Germans or the Russians. And for 45 years, with the exception of the critical period of the Berlin airlift, where the Soviets actually blocked that rail path, that train ran to get soldiers to and their families to and from West Berlin. So when the wall came down, the German government actually gifted us one of the passenger cars and one of the guard cars. So we have those here in the exhibit. So they're some of my favorites. And in fact, there's some great stories out of that. There's actually a noir film about one of the incidents with the train in the 50s that we talk about a little bit here in the exhibit.
That's awesome. And what about the Vietnam War? Was there much transportation? I'm sure there was, but as far as rail in Vietnam?
Vietnam is an area that I'm still doing my own homework. I'm chronologically working my way through the history of the various modes of transportation. So I'm least familiar with Vietnam. I do know we heavily used the rail here in the United States to move our sustainment material to the ports to ship over to Vietnam. There's some reporting of rail operations in Vietnam, but it was not a hugely developed network, and it was much easily interdicted in Vietnam, so it did not see the service that I think we saw in Korea and Vietnam. But again, I'll freely admit that's probably my weakest area currently on rail history in the Army. But I will jump way ahead. Interestingly enough, in one of the gaps is in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan had little to no rail infrastructure due to the extent of the war that happened before we arrived in 2002. But we actually helped the Afghans establish their first rail organization. And here we've changed how we did business. We were no longer operating the trains. We were more advisors. So what we did is we sent up the Afghan Rail Administration, so mirrored on the Federal Rail Administration, for them to help provide oversight and inspection and ensure the safety of the operation of the rail line that was established in northern Afghanistan. And it was Army railroaders that formed what we called the Afghan Rail Advisory Team, then ARAT, to go advise that for several years as an effort to kind of support the rebuilding of that nation. So so you see it a lot. And then I do know in Vietnam they did have, to go back to Vietnam, they did have some armored cars that they did on some of the rails. So we do have some photos of that. But again, I haven't delved how deeply and where those operated as much. But armored cars go all the way back to the Civil War. So just like hospital cars, the Civil War is kind of the start of the innovation for rail from a military perspective.
Yeah. So I want to take just a moment now to recognize our new gold sponsor. And our new gold sponsor is EnviroServe. So let me tell you a little bit about them. EnviroServe is America's premier provider of comprehensive, reliable, effective, and eco-friendly environmental solutions for the rail industry. Their rail services include mobile rail car cleaning, flaring, interior blasting and transloading, removal and replacement of tank car service equipment, and leak testing, complete HAZ and non-HAZ waste handling, management, remediation, and disposal services, 24/7 emergency spill response, and more. To learn more, please visit their website at www.enviroserve.com. I also want to congratulate the recent acquisition of CG Environmental by EnviroServe. They are now together as one. And thank you to Shelby White, Scott Denson, and Randy Reed for all of your efforts in putting together this sponsorship. We're glad to have you on board the American Railroading Podcast as our gold sponsor. So thank you to you and to your entire team at EnviroServe. Okay, now let's jump into the museum. I know you can't wait to talk more about the museum itself. So when was the museum founded and by whom?
So the museum, it kind of happened somewhat organically within the Transportation Corps. We continued as we developed new equipment. They kind of saw the uniqueness of saving some of this equipment, so they would set pieces aside, and retired, senior officers would come in with their collections and they would donate it. So it operated informally as early as the 60s, but really we get a bump similar to what we're hopefully we're going through as a nation now, leading into the bicentennial. So the Transportation Corps literally sees like, hey, we need to formalize this. So the leaders in the Transportation Corps form what is called the Army Transportation Museum Foundation. So it is our nonprofit arm that still operates and still supports the museum today. So there are nonprofit fundraisers and partners here at the museum that actually are on the campus with us even today. But they start raising money to build a deliberate museum to tell the story of the Transportation Corps. They break ground in 1975. So for the bicentennial, so the groundbreaking anniversary is 50 years next year. And then they open the doors in 1976 formally. The building is named after General Besson, who is one of the key critical leaders of the Transportation Corps. He goes on to 4-star rank. He serves at every level. He actually served on the Iranian Railroad during the Second World War. He's responsible for a lot of unique aspects of the Transportation Corps. Also famous for kind of encouraging the development of roll-on, roll-off ships that still impact the rail industry today. But the building is named after him. And then since 1975, we've gone through pretty much 3 major renovations where we've added space because the history's increased, right? The initial increase is really to add a Korea and Vietnam gallery so we can better tell that story. And then our most recent addition is the addition of an Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom galleries. But outside of the museum, we have 3 what we call outdoor pavilion areas. So we have one that covers all our trucks, one that covers mostly aircraft, and then our most significant for your listeners is our rail pavilion, where we have a whole host of rail equipment that we have on display. And then we also have a few other pieces that are out there just because of the size of the pavilion. It's set up like a train station. So you go up on the platforms to look at the trains. We have 3 major locomotives. We have the last steam engine that saw service with the United States Army that was retired here in the 70s. The reason they kept steam so long is because if they were operating overseas, a lot of those countries still had some steam power that they were using. So our Army rail operators that went overseas had to be familiar with steam operations. And then we have 2 diesel electric engines, one of which saw service in Iran. And when it completed its mission, it actually came back to the States. It was sold off, and it was used by the Alaskan Department of Transportation for years in Alaska, continuing to serve in a civilian capacity. So very much like our veterans, even our equipment has a post-military life that they do amazing things. And then eventually it even ended up in the Smithsonian collection for several years before it was returned to the Army, and we've been able to display it since. And then our last is our diesel electric engine that was actually shipped from the States to Korea, saw service in Korea, and then was returned to the States. And its history goes from the Korean War all the way through Desert Storm and Desert Shield. It actually helped carry some of the ammo to the ships to be loaded from the United States to be transshipped to Saudi Arabia during that conflict. So again, most of our vehicles are multi-war veterans. The strength of the rail industry is the durability of its equipment, and it tends to see multiple conflict service. So I like to look at them as veterans in their own right, so that they should have their own campaign ribbons and things along those lines. So each of ours has some pretty profound service. And then I already mentioned the Berlin duty car and the guard car that goes with that. So.
Just to give people an idea of the breadth and width and scope of what the museum has, how many artifacts and exhibits are there?
So total artifacts, we're sitting at about 7,000, just over 7,600 artifacts. Now that's everything from the smallest pin all the way up to the diesel engine. We have about 6% of our artifacts on display, which is actually pretty high for a museum. And mainly that's because we can't put our vehicles away. They're just too large. We're going to have them out. If we're going to have them out, we're going to have them out on display. So all our rail pieces are on display. The pieces from the rail industry that are not on display is obviously we have the obligatory collection of rail lanterns that we all in the rail industry love to collect and talk about. Ours is pales into comparison, and to probably many of your listeners, we've had several of them come by, and they have upwards of 200 rail lanterns of various makes and models. But we have ones that have provenance to use by Army railroaders. And I would say one of our most profound artifacts that we have is actually connected to the railroad industry. We actually have General Herman Haupt's frock coat from the American Civil War. So probably our most oldest and significant artifact that we have is that jacket. So that is definitely worth coming to see. And then right next to it, we have one of my favorite two exhibits because it shows the Civil War track from both the developed Union side and then the lesser developed Confederate side and what they were having to do to try to operate some of the rails. So that really drives home the difference between those two things from a very visceral, physical way that you can see these are not competing at the same level from an industrial perspective. So those are some of the artifacts. Again, we also have lots of uniforms that were worn in different places by American railroaders. On exhibit currently, we have a railroader's outfit from the China-Burma India Theater, which is a very light linen top and actually, believe it or not, shorts and knee-high socks that they borrowed from the British because it was better suited to the jungle environments that they were operating on. On the reverse, we have the more traditional Ike jacket from a railroader who started his career with one of the first World War II rail operating battalions in Alaska, where we were helping do the from Seward up to the Alcan Highway. We were running material up so they could build the Alcan Highway. He does that for several years before he gets deployed overseas, and he actually goes to the Pacific Theater to help out in the Philippines. So he saw both stateside, significant stateside service and some overseas service. And then probably the hidden gem that most people don't appreciate about our collection is we have a pretty strong archive here that we're doing a lot of work in the near term to try to digitize. So currently, this isn't the total number of photos. This is the numbers that we've digitized. Is we've got over 4,900 rail photos that we've digitized from our collection so that we can share it with folks. And then after we get through some of the photos, we're going to move into some of the paperwork we have. So we have both unit records for all those rail units that operated in World War I and World War II. But we also have some pretty good collections of personal papers from both those conflicts from Army railroaders. So I love to compare and contrast those two things because one is the official record of what the unit was saying it was doing. And then oftentimes you'll have the diaries and the letters of somebody else that is complaining of how hard it was to get to the execution that they're talking about in the official record. And sometimes the photos are a little bit more interesting as well because you see the true life of a soldier in those individual collections that may not always come through in the official record. But everything from World War II Christmas cards, but issued by rail battalions to just the normal train schedules and things like that they created are part of our archive. So those are huge pieces of what we have and that we offer researchers that are interested in this topic.
Well, believe it or not, Sepp, we're nearing the end of the episode already. We've been going for an hour. Time just flies. But is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we go today?
I'd just like to invite everybody to come by and visit the museum. We're located at Fort Eustis, which is in Newport News, Virginia, so smack in between Norfolk Naval Yard and Colonial Williamsburg is where you can find us. We are open to the public. You will have to access the military installation, so you'll have to stop at the visitor center and give them your driver's license so that they can process you onto the installation. But other than that, we are a free museum. It's America's history, so we want to share it with all Americans. So feel free to come by and visit us. We're available online. We have a Facebook account, and then you'll have the museum webpage as well that you can reference to see what we do have on display. And like I said, we cover all modes of transportation, but I like to say history happens when something moves. So please come see us, and we'll share the amazing history of the Transportation Corps with you.
Absolutely. And we'll also be sharing the links to the museum and to the Army Transportation Corps websites on the podcast link. So everybody can check that out. So where can people reach you if they'd like to reach out to you personally?
So if you want to reach out to me, I can give you my government email. Unfortunately, it's really long, but it's Joseph, JOSEPH period Scanlin, my last name, SCANLIN, then the number 2 period CIV, and then @ and then mail.army. At army.mail. Say that again, at army.mail. And my phone number is 757-878-1115. So again, that's 757-878-1115 is for the museum. So you can reach us there, and feel free to give us a call or drop me an email. Again, we love to hear from people that are interested in our history and have something to share with us. So
yeah, and we'll include your contact information on your guest profile too. So if our listeners and viewers don't know, when you go to our website at AmericanRailroading.net and look up a particular episode, the guest information will be there for every one of their profiles. So would you like to join us again on a future episode?
Oh, I'd love to. And again, I'm hoping to get some people that can talk some more military modern railroading. We still have railroaders here in the Army. Fort Eustis is where they train. So this is the home of Army Railroad. In fact, it's the home of all Department of Defense Railroad. They certify all rail operations across the Department of Defense through the Army. So again, I think we have a lot to share with your listeners. And we have some great partners out there that we look forward to connecting you with as well. And then again, thanks for giving us the opportunity to share this with you and your listeners. We really appreciate the partnership that you've shown. I think it's, again, indicative of how the industry and the Army have partnered over literally the history of the nation. So we're just living what our veterans have given us in the past. And then I wish you a happy birthday next month.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. And thank you for your time as well. Look forward to having you on future episodes. And I do plan on coming out to visit. Not sure when I can make it out there, but I definitely will.
Just let me know. We'll get a tour together.
Sounds great. Thank you again, Sepp. Appreciate you joining us today. And with that, I want to turn to my 2 cents. So the railroad industry has played a pivotal role in military operations from nearly the beginning of the railroading in the U.S. And you can see and feel that relationship not only in our love and support of the men and women in our military, with our veterans, as well as those that are currently enlisted, but also by the fact that there are so many veterans who join, as Sepp talked about earlier, that join the industry after leaving the military. Some say that number is nearly 50% of those who work in transportation. It's a relationship I'm very proud to be a part of and to support. And that's my 2 cents. So again, we're launching our 2nd annual Honor Our Heroes gift package this month. So again, it's just like a care package, except it's specially designed for our veterans, and it could be anyone in the rail industry that is a veteran of our U.S. Armed Forces. So you don't have to be a railroader. You don't have to work for Class 1 or a short line, as I said earlier. You can actually just have anything to do with rail, whether you're with a leasing company, manufacturing company, parts supplier, or whatever, as long as it's rail related. And it's sponsored again by our friends at Boots for Troops here in Tomball, Texas. And it is free, folks. It doesn't cost you anything to nominate anybody. It doesn't cost the recipient anything. And if you'd like to nominate someone, here's how you can do that. Just as a reminder, you can email us at Boots for Troops. You can email Boots for Troops at info@boots4troops.com. Again, info@boots4troops.com. Be sure to put in the American Railroading Podcast Honor Our Heroes nominee in the subject line, and then include their name, their branch of military, rank, the years served, medals and awards, the rail-related job that they have, and who they work for or who they retired from. And then tell us why you think they should be honored as an Honor Our Heroes Award winner. All nominations, again, must be in by Friday, September 13th. And then we'll be announcing the winner in the September episode 2024. With that, I want to thank again our platinum sponsor, the Alden Company. Let me tell you a little about them. Founded in 1904, Alden has been an industry leader, charting a steady course in the manufacturing and distribution of a wide variety of railroad safety and track repair tools and more. The Alden website boasts over 800 catalog items to choose from, with categories including track maintenance and repair, derailers and railers, signs and lights, wheel chocks and stops, rail cars and locomotives, and even truck docks. Alden provides outstanding customer service with a wide variety of solutions, and when you call them, you will always get a real person to talk to, not an automated service. While based in the Chicagoland area, the Alden name is known internationally, and with over 120 years in the rail industry, they're a company you can count on. Please reach out to our friends at Alden today at 847-623-8800 or e-rail@aldenco.com. You can also review all of their products and resources on their website at www.aldenco.com. Alden, keeping things on track since 1904. And I'd also like to recognize our anchor sponsor, the Revolution Rail Group. So again, we are a consulting and brokering firm in the railcar industry, and we can do everything from process flow analysis, market analysis, any consulting really that you need in the industry, we can help you with that. We can also do brokering services for buying, selling, leasing, and subleasing of rail cars. You can reach out to us today at 844-455-3434 or info@therevolutionrailgroup.com. You can also check out our full suite of services on our website at therevolutionrailgroup.com. Our next episode is coming soon in my birthday month. Did I say that already? My birthday month. With that, I want to say, God bless, make it a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the American Railroading Podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. And if you have a topic you'd like us to cover on a future episode or want to support or sponsor the show, please visit our website at AmericanRailroading.net.